Welcome to the Geek Critique's first ever Patreon exclusive episode, and thank you for backing the channel. When it came time to consider what subject might make for a good exclusive, I knew it couldn't be like previous bonus episodes. Like, it couldn't be something as integral to a series as Other M is to Metroid. It needs to be something interesting, but extraneous. It needs to be something valuable, but tangential. It needs to be, dare I say, an add-on. And when I think of extraneous, expensive add-ons, I think of SEGA. My previous Dreamcast episode, Sega's Fall from the Cutting Edge, was all about trying to impress upon the viewer what it was like for me as someone who had grown up with Sega to live through the company's final console. I wanted to memorialize the Sega that made me a gamer for people who were too young to remember those glory days, and create a sort of time capsule of that perspective for people who were. To that end, I refined the script, focusing on just a few of the Dreamcast's most definitive games, trying to relate why those titles in this system were so special to Sega fans, and to me personally. And not to toot my own horn, but I do love how it turned out. But you know, there is a lot that I left out. And like I said, that's fine. My intent might have gotten muddled if I'd rambled about the hardware design, the controllers, the peripherals, or the piracy. This might be an add-on, but hopefully it'll be more of a value add that does something interesting than an abject waste of everyone's time and money. I'll do my best. Let's get critiquing! The previous episode identified two things that I believe really doomed the Dreamcast. One was the looming threat of the PlayStation 2, and the other was Sega's well-earned awful reputation among gamers. Perhaps it's no surprise then that I got plenty of comments postulating other things that might have led to the system's downfall. One of the most prevalent goes something like this. It was piracy, they say, that really drove the stake into the Dreamcast. After all, the system was cracked wide open within 6 months of release, and spurred on by a scene that dumped brand new games just days after they came out. No mod chip or special hardware was required. You could literally just download a game and burn it to a blank CD. Console manufacturers to this day tend to lose money selling hardware, well, unless they're Nintendo, and so especially early in a console's life, they depend on strong software sales to make up the difference. Because Dreamcast games were so easy to pirate, it meant that Sega, a company that was already operating on razor-thin margins after so many expensive failures, had no chance of being profitable. This is, I admit, a really compelling and widespread theory, and I understand why it gets so much traction. Anecdotally, in the year 2000, I was the only 7th grader I knew who even owned a Dreamcast. Most of the remaining Sega faithful seemed to skew a little older, and worse yet, they tended to be pretty tech-savvy. So, did piracy really help kill the Dreamcast? I don't think so. The idea that piracy had that much of an impact has always seemed like a stretch, like people are judging the issue by much more modern standards. You've got to remember, this was the year 2000. While CD burners were becoming more common, they had only just started coming with brand new computers. Much more importantly though, most of us were still on dial-up. In the best case scenario at 56K, downloading just 1 gig of data would have tied up your phone line for over 40 hours. But maybe this is too anecdotal. To debunk this theory, all we really have to do is look at the Dreamcast's tie ratio, which measures, on average, how many Dreamcast games each Dreamcast owner bought. At the end of January 2001, when Sega announced that it was discontinuing the system and going third-party, the Dreamcast enjoyed an 8-to-1 tie ratio. So for every 1 Dreamcast sold, 8 Dreamcast games were sold. This tie ratio puts the Dreamcast on par with much more successful systems like the Super Nintendo and Xbox 360, and it ranks significantly higher than the N64, Game Boy Advance, and even the Switch. And if you look at North America alone, the tie ratio was even higher, around 9-to-1. But here's the problem. This kind of tie ratio doesn't do you much good with such a tiny install base. For comparison, the average GBA owner only had 4 or 5 games, and if you just look at this metric, the Dreamcast looks like it's blowing it out of the water. But of course, a lot more people had a GBA, meaning that this little number translates into 377 million games sold, compared to the Dreamcast's paltry 85 million. But here's the bottom line. Piracy didn't kill the system. The fact that it can play games from CDRs with no special hardware is the reason it's still thinking. The reason that it's still getting new releases to this day. But back when the Dreamcast was on the market, I would question whether piracy really made much difference at all. Most of us who bought a Dreamcast bought a lot of games for it, an average of 9 titles in a little more than a year. We were hardcore gamers, hardcore Sega fans, and we were dedicated to this platform. There just weren't enough of us left. But maybe there's something else Sega could have done to incentivize people, aside from the loyalists, to give the Dreamcast a chance. Maybe there was a way to hook people who might not even be gamers. And this is another topic that got a lot of spicy comments. So here's a segment that I left on the cutting room floor of the original episode. What if instead of including a modem with every system, Sega had instead opted for a DVD drive? Even if it jacked up the price by a few $100, having a $400 or even $500 DVD player that also plays games on the market in the late 90s could have changed everything. Moreover, it could have completely sidestepped the bad reputation that the Sega brand had among gamers by selling the Dreamcast to non-gamers. This could have completely upended the market in Sega's favor. The only problem with that is, Sega never ever would have done that. Sega was not some conglomerate that happened to have a computer entertainment division. Sega was a video game company. Every single one of those crazy, offbeat, ridiculous, awful, wonderful ideas they developed, everything they did was in service of games. And to be fair, Sega did consider it as an option. I mean, there's a reason it became standard. A higher density disc could certainly allow for better games. But how would watching a movie on the Dreamcast make games better? How would that make it a better video game system? It wouldn't. I mean, since Sega's exit from the console race 18 years ago, Nintendo has been the only pure gaming company still standing. And it's no accident that none of their systems ever played DVD movies either. So instead of licensing DVDs, Dreamcast games would be sold on proprietary GD-ROM discs, a format which could still hold significantly more data than a CD. Instead of designing a game system that also played movies, Sega spent that money on what brought them to the dance. They took a reckless leap of faith into something the world might not have been quite ready for, and led the charge into online console gaming. And that would be their final dance. Their perfect denouement. Wow. That was melodramatic. Anyway, so how about the hardware? The Dreamcast was a beautifully designed game console that stood out in its time for how compact it was. I say in its time because it was outdone by the even more fun-sized GameCube just a few years later. And like the GameCube, seeing shots of it in magazines didn't do it justice. I was surprised they fit such a powerful system into such a small form factor, especially something with a disk drive. And here's something else that made it stand out. Sega systems, going back as far as I could remember, were rectangles built out of matte black plastic. But the Dreamcast was this off-white cream color, with cleaner, more rounded edges and a smooth, integrated design for the lid. It didn't immediately look like a Sega console, and that break from tradition seemed intentional. The Sega brand wasn't often even paired with Dreamcast in marketing. However, this only really applied outside of Japan. Put a Dreamcast next to a Model 2 Japanese Saturn, and it's dead obvious they're related. Same color, same gray power button, even the colored buttons on the controller match. So it wasn't really that the Dreamcast was trying to look less like the Saturn, it was kind of the other way around. The Saturn was the one that had been revamped outside of Japan, so it would resemble the internationally successful Genesis. Still, I always kind of wanted the Sega Sports model, just so it'd match with the rest of my systems. The Dreamcast actually had a surprising number of special editions in Japan, and let's be real, I always kind of wanted them all. But regardless of what color the plastic is, the hardware didn't look like anything that had come out before, and I guess this really goes without saying, but I freaking love it. This is probably gonna cause somebody half my age to call me something that's normally reserved for people twice my age, but screw it. This generation was the last time game systems looked like game systems, instead of software entertainment devices for serious-minded adults. The Dreamcast was a beautiful design, selling itself as a sophisticated, futuristic marvel that wasn't ashamed to be a toy. But if the console stood out in a good way, it's often argued the controller was a little too weird for its own good. So I guess this isn't a surprise either. I never had a problem with it. I don't know, I thought it was pretty neat that the cord came out the bottom. Now, yes, through a modern lens, stuff like the plasticky analog stick, the lack of a second stick, and only having 2 shoulder buttons might seem like issues. But I think a lot of the quote-unquote problems with the Dreamcast are really just the result of looking at it through that modern lens. Because at the time, it was a big improvement over the N64's controller, and that by default made it the best analog pad I had ever laid hands on. Though of course, the Dreamcast controller was not the best one on the market. What? Ew! No, not that! Look, the original PSX controller was okay as far as cheap second-rate Super NES knockoffs go, but when Sony came out with the DualShock, they just grafted 2 analog sticks onto the existing design. These bulbous, unnatural growths springing forth out of the plastic. Oh, I thought it felt horrible, which, you know, became a bit of a problem for me when Sony stuck with that placement for the next 25 years. I've begrudgingly gotten pretty used to it, and the PS4 controller in particular is a big improvement. And yes, I know the millions of people who grew up with the DualShock had no problem with it. This is a me problem. I'm biased. I know. My team lost. Let me indulge. But when I said this wasn't the best analog pad on the market, I was actually talking about something a little more obscure. "3D, the final frontier." These are the voyages of SEGA Enterprises Limited. Its 5-year mission: to thrive into the 21st century, to seek out new genres and new player experiences, to boldly go where no game has gone before. I'm a professional. Yeah. I give you the Sega Saturn 3D controller. You thought it was weird having the cord come out the bottom? Well, this thing's cord comes off completely! This was the first modern-style analog pad on the market, and for my money, it was for a long time the best. I think it easily outclasses the N64, DualShock, and even the Dreamcast. Obviously though, the DC does take a lot of inspiration from this design, but unfortunately, the worst things about the Dreamcast controller are the things that it changed. The Dreamcast D-pad it gets the job done, but the Saturn features Sega's legendary circular D-pad, which is still, in my opinion, the best the industry has ever seen. The Saturn controller also has that ideal 6-button arcade layout, and really, how did we settle for 4 face buttons becoming standard? But really, the Dreamcast pad is fine. The analog stick is a little plasticky, yes, but it has good resistance and is crazy accurate, though it definitely is prone to wear and tear, but hey, you can still find brand new controllers for pretty cheap. But alright, I've been kind of glossing over the most glaringly unique thing about this controller. If Sega was infamous for its add-ons, how appropriate is it that even the controllers of their final console come standard with not 1, but 2 expansion ports? Hit it! Give up, the funky rhythm, Let me take you on a trip. Let me take you on a ride. The Dreamcast was the final console to have its Rumble feature sold separately. Admittedly, I never had the official jump pack, but this third-party variant freaking rocks. Now, yes, having Rumble built in nowadays is obviously a lot more convenient, but I don't know, I never feel like it's nearly as powerful in modern controllers. Like, here's the tornado scene in Sonic Adventure playing on the Xbox One, and here's what it's doing to my controller. Now, here's the same scene in the original game. I don't know, even built-in Rumble doesn't feel as heavy as it used to. Much as I've whined about the old DualShock, it probably had the best rumble of any controller ever. I mean, that thing could freaking go! And now the PS4 pad is just, yeah, okay, I guess I can shake a little if you want. There were a few other things you could slam dunk into your Dreamcast pad, like a microphone that let you talk to fish, or a sadly never released MP3 player, but okay. One stood far above the others. And covering this little gizmo ended up being such a monumental undertaking that I decided to make it the subject of the Geek Critique's second ever Patreon exclusive bonus episode. Seriously, it took me half an hour to cover this thing. If you are so inclined, that episode is up on Patreon right now. And hey, why not? Let's see a preview. It was the mid to late 90s, and CD-based consoles were becoming the new standard. Unfortunately for all of us, the industry was still about a decade away from consoles with internal storage becoming standard. Well, except both the Sega CD and Sega Saturn had built-in storage, but come on, whoever played a Saturn, am I right? I'm so alone. So if you actually wanted to save your progress in Metal Gear Solid, instead of starting the whole thing over every time you turned on your PlayStation, you would need to shell out another $20 on a memory card. This is a little rectangular brick that you'd plug into your console, and so long as it did its job, you'd never really have to think about it again. Until it inevitably ran out of space and you had to run back to Kmart and lose another $20, and come on, when's 2005 gonna get here? I'm so sick of these things! But there was one memory card that would stand out above the others. The Dreamcast Visual Memory Unit did so much more than just save your games. It actually was a teeny tiny game system unto itself. And you know, certain other, less ambitious, objectively less good console makers might have stopped there. Come on guys, you can play minigames, isn't that good enough? Not at all, said Sega, as they built a video game controller with a window. Pop the VMU in, and now whether you're bombing downhill in Crazy Taxi, having an existential experience with Rez, or doing whatever the crap this is supposed to be, you now have a second screen built into the controller.
Alright, that's all I got for you here. Thank you all for watching, thank you to my patrons for making this possible, happy 20th to the Dreamcast,
and until next time, you keep geeking, I'll keep critiquing.